Japan gave the world bullet trains, samurai legends, sushi, anime, and robotics. It rose from atomic ruins to become a tech superpower, a cultural icon. But to understand Japan before the nuclear disaster, before the bullet train, before it became a tech superpower, we have to go back to where it all began. The story began with scattered bands of humans living off the land. Around 35,000 years ago, Paleolithic peoples crossed over from the Asian mainland, making their way onto what would later become the Japanese islands. These early settlers didn't build cities or kingdoms. They lived close to the earth, moving with the seasons, shaping stone into tools for survival. Their existence left no written records, but their tools and bones remain as the first whispers of Japanese history. Simple blades, scrapers, and spear points carved from obsidian and quartzite tell us that even then, Japan was home to clever hands and adapting minds. Life was hard, but these early inhabitants endured, chasing game, fishing rivers, and harvesting from wild forests. The Paleolithic Japanese lived in small mobile groups, each one dependent on the rhythms of nature. They made shelter in caves or under overhangs, and sometimes built temporary dwellings using wood, bone, and thatch. Fire became their companion, for warmth, for cooking, and for scaring off predators that lurked beyond the trees. These communities weren't connected by roads or language, but by the shared instinct to survive. Over time, they grew more skilled in shaping the tools that shaped their lives. Archaeological sites in places like Kyushu and Honshu show where these first footsteps were made, etched quietly into the soil of prehistory. As the Ice Age gripped the Earth, Japan's geography was still forming. Sea levels were lower, and land bridges connected the archipelago to the Asian continent, allowing animals and humans to travel freely across. Mammoths, giant deer, and bears roamed the dense forests and open plains, hunted carefully with hand-carved spears and persistence. These early people didn't tame the land. They adapted to it, studying animal patterns and building spiritual respect for nature. There were no rulers, no religion, only survival and instinct. Yet in that struggle, something human persisted, a quiet will to stay alive, to learn, and to build. The absence of metal or pottery in Paleolithic Japan didn't mean the people were primitive. It meant they used what was available. Obsidian blades from mountain quarries suggest early trade, or at least wide movement between groups. The craftsmanship found in their tools speaks of generations passing down knowledge through practice and repetition. While we may never know their names, we can trace their lives through the careful shaping of a blade or the way a fire pit was placed near a cave wall. They didn't write history, they carved it. Their legacy is one of quiet beginnings that would eventually give way to culture, community, and transformation. By the end of the Paleolithic period, the foundation was laid for something deeper to emerge. The land warmed, glaciers melted, and the seas rose, cutting Japan off from the mainland. What had once been connected became an island world, a closed stage for a long, unfolding story. But the people stayed. They adapted again, and their descendants would mark the next chapter, not just with stone tools, but with clay, patterns, and the first signs of a culture that saw beauty in the everyday. Japan was ready to become more than survival. It was ready to become a society. The Jomon period began with fire and clay, a revolution of patience and precision. Around 14,000 BCE, the people of Japan began crafting some of the world's oldest known pottery. These weren't just cooking pots, they were art. Coiled, decorated, fired in open flame, each vessel held not only food but identity. The name Jomon itself means cord pattern, a reference to the rope-like impressions pressed into the wet clay. These pots were more than tools. They were the first signs of a culture that sought to express, to symbolize, to remember. With the warming climate came more stable environments, Rivers flowed stronger, forests thickened, and the people of the Jomon began to settle. No longer fully nomadic, they built semi-permanent homes, deep pit dwellings dug into the ground, roofed with wood and thatch. Communities began to form along coasts and rivers, where fishing and gathering could support growing populations. Shell middens, giant heaps of discarded shells and bones, mark where they lived, where they feasted, and where they buried their dead. These weren't just survival shelters. They were homes with hearths, with boundaries, with stories. A people once shaped by wilderness were now beginning to shape their world. The Jomon people were complex. They created ornaments, figurines, and ritual objects that hint at belief systems and spiritual life. One of their most mysterious creations was the dog. Small clay figurines with large eyes, exaggerated limbs, and stylized forms. Some believe these were fertility symbols. Others say they were charms, or perhaps early gods. Whatever they were, they reveal a people beginning to question more than food and shelter. The Jomon saw spirit in soil, meaning in the shape of a figure, mystery in the world around them. This wasn't just daily life. It was life with depth, with symbolism, and perhaps even with prayer. Trade and communication between regions also began to emerge. Obsidian from faraway sources appeared in Jomon sites hundreds of miles away. Certain pottery styles spread across wide areas, suggesting either migration or exchange. And while they remained isolated from the rest of the world, the Jomon archipelago was alive with internal connection. Forests became pathways, rivers became highways, and mountains became markers of identity. Though they had no writing system, they carved meaning into movement, pottery, and structure. Their world was both grounded and sacred, tied to place, to memory, and to the rituals that marked seasons and souls. As the Jomon period neared its end, the people had grown into a deeply rooted society, still without kings, armies, or cities, but rich with culture. They hunted, gathered, fished, and crafted for thousands of years in continuity. But beneath this long peace, change was stirring. New migrants were coming. New tools, new crops, and new ways of life would soon reshape the land. The world of clay and cord patterns would slowly give way to one of rice, bronze, and hierarchy. But the Jomon spirit, its artistry, its reverence, its quiet endurance, would echo through the ages, etched forever into the soul of Japan. The shift from Jomon to Yayoi life didn't happen overnight. It arrived quietly, like seeds planted in a changing soil. Around 300 BCE, new groups began to migrate into Japan from the Korean peninsula and parts of China, bringing with them transformative knowledge. These newcomers didn't just bring new ideas, they brought rice. Wet rice agriculture, introduced to the Japanese archipelago, reshaped everything: the land, the labor, and the rhythm of life itself. Fields replaced forests, and instead of foraging wild plants, communities now harvested what they had sown. With farming came surplus, and with surplus came structure. The Yayoi people cultivated rice in irrigated paddies, which required cooperation, planning, and shared effort. Villages began to grow, centered around the labor of planting and harvesting. Social structures emerged as those who controlled land and tools began to rise in status. With the introduction of bronze and iron, farming became more efficient, but so did conflict. Tools became weapons, and regional power began to form around clans who had both resources and influence. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about organizing, leading, and protecting. Metallurgy advanced rapidly during this time. Bronze was used for ceremonial items, like bells, mirrors, and spears, symbols of power and prestige. Iron, more practical and durable, was used for tools and weapons that made agriculture and defense more effective. Grave goods from this era show clear differences in wealth and status, proving that social classes had formed. The days of egalitarian Jomon life were gone. This was now a world of rulers, warriors, and farmers. Japan was becoming complex, competitive, and shaped by the tools it could forge. Trade and contact with mainland Asia increased significantly. Pottery styles, weapon designs, and even burial customs show strong influence from the Korean Peninsula and China's Han Dynasty. Japan was not yet a centralized state, but networks of clans and regional powers were emerging, some growing large enough to dominate others. The migration during the Yayoi period didn't erase the Jomon people. It blended with them. Cultures mixed, knowledge evolved, and from that mix, Japan's early society began to take form. The island was now part of a wider world, connected, competitive, and growing in confidence. By the end of the Yayoi period, Japan had been reshaped from the ground up. Wet rice agriculture had locked communities into place and into hierarchies. Metal had turned survival into strategy, and outsiders had brought in systems that pushed Japan toward organized leadership. What started as a series of scattered rice fields would soon become something bigger. Territories, alliances, and eventually the seeds of monarchy. The soil of Japan was no longer wild. It was tamed, measured, and ruled. If the Yayoi period introduced status, the Kofun period announced power. Named after the massive burial mounds or Kofun built for elite rulers, this era marked the visible rise of political authority in Japan. These tombs, shaped like keyholes and surrounded by moats, were constructed on a scale never seen before. Some were hundreds of meters long, requiring thousands of laborers and signaling the immense control their rulers held. The dead were buried with weapons, armor, mirrors, and jewels, symbols of might and heavenly connection. Japan now had kings, or at least something very close. At the center of this growing hierarchy was the Yamato clan. Originating in the Kansai region, the Yamato steadily expanded their influence through alliances, marriage, conquest, and diplomacy. They claimed divine descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu, a claim that would later define the legitimacy of Japan's emperors. Their power wasn't total. Rival clans still held influence, but the Yamato were different. They didn't just conquer, they organized. They laid the groundwork for Japan's first unified leadership, centralizing power through ritual, warfare, and political savvy. The scale of their rule was reflected not only in tombs, but in administration. The Yamato began adopting ideas from China's sophisticated bureaucracy, especially through contact with Korea. Titles, ranks, and official rituals were borrowed and localized. Writing was not yet widespread, but oral traditions and symbol systems helped preserve status and records. Rulers were no longer just warriors. They were priests, managers, and figureheads for a growing kingdom. The Yamato court became the seat of an early proto-state, one built not just on force, but on order. International contact during the Kofun period was crucial. The Yamato sent envoys to China and maintained close ties with Korean kingdoms like Baekje and Silla. Through these relationships, Japan imported Confucian ideas, Buddhist influence, and advanced technologies. Horses, iron armor, and new agricultural methods arrived, accelerating development. These exchanges weren't always peaceful. Border conflicts and regional skirmishes persisted. But the movement of ideas was steady and transformative. Japan was looking outward, learning and preparing to stand among larger civilizations. The Kofun period closed with a clear shift in identity. The Yamato rulers were no longer local warlords. They were national symbols. Through military strength, diplomacy, and divine myth, they had begun to unite the islands. The land was still fragmented, but the dream of a single Japan had taken root. A nation was being imagined. One ruler, one people, one divine lineage. The ground beneath the tombs wasn't just burial earth. It was political soil, holding the foundation of Japan's future monarchy. The Yamato period overlaps with the Kofun era, but carries a different weight. It was the beginning of something imperial. While the tombs marked death, the court marked life. Ceremonies, titles, alliances, and the slow shaping of national identity. The Yamato rulers were not yet emperors in the modern sense, but they were more than mere clan heads. They established an early court with ministers, rankings, and regional governors. They began to refer to themselves as Great Kings of Wa, presenting themselves as legitimate equals to other East Asian monarchs. This wasn't just leadership, it was ideology. Central to Yamato rule was the myth of divine ancestry. They claimed descent from Amaterasu, the sun goddess, solidifying their position not through conquest alone, but through the sacred. These myths weren't decorative, they were foundational. They linked governance to heaven, making rebellion not just treason but blasphemy. Shrines were built, rituals formalized, and oral traditions carefully preserved. This mythological narrative would one day become the backbone of the imperial household's legitimacy, even lasting into the modern Reiwa era. For Yamato, politics and religion were inseparable. Despite their growing power, the Yamato rulers were not unchallenged. Powerful clans like the Soga, Mononobe, and Nakatomi vied for influence within the court. Political marriages, assassinations, and shifting alliances defined the era's internal struggles. The Yamato were skillful, but their court was a web of ambition. Still, through this struggle, new systems took shape. Bureaucratic positions, land ownership policies, and alliances with temple leaders. The state wasn't just ruled from above. It was built through constant negotiation. This was also the era when Shinto began to mature into a structured belief system. While still rooted in animism and local spirit worship, Shinto under Yamato guidance took on national significance. Shrines were no longer just local. They became connected to the state. Seasonal festivals, imperial rituals, and mythic genealogy were all woven into governance. The emperor wasn't just a man. He was a living connection between the people and the gods. Faith and rule became one language, spoken from the palace to the peasant fields. As the Yamato period drew to a close, Japan stood on the edge of becoming something new. The court was becoming more organized, foreign ideas were flooding in, and a cultural identity was beginning to crystallize. The transition into the Asuka period would bring Buddhism, written language, and official reforms. But those came after. For now, Japan was still rooted in its own soil, its own myths, and its own rhythms. The Yamato era was not yet a dynasty, but it was a direction, the first long shadow of the empire that would follow. The Asuka period marked Japan's first real step toward becoming a centralized nation. It began with the official arrival of Buddhism in 538 CE, a moment that reshaped Japan's cultural and political future. A delegation from the Korean kingdom of Baekje presented the Yamato court with a statue of the Buddha, scriptures, and ceremonial objects. For the first time, Japan encountered a religion with temples, teachings, and written doctrine. Not everyone welcomed it. Some clans resisted, fearing it would undermine Shinto traditions. But for others, especially rising leaders, Buddhism offered something powerful: legitimacy, order, and a gateway to advanced statecraft. Among its earliest champions was Prince Shotoku, the regent and political visionary who transformed Japan's identity. Though never an emperor, his influence was vast. He adopted Chinese-style governance, promoted moral philosophy, and strengthened the central authority of the Yamato court. In 604, he issued the 17-article constitution, which wasn't a legal code in the modern sense but a set of guiding principles. It emphasized harmony, merit-based leadership, respect for Buddhist teachings, and loyalty to the sovereign. For a country still defined by regional clans and rivalries, this was radical. It was a blueprint for national unity. Shotoku also recognized that Japan could not modernize in isolation. He sent official envoys to the Sui dynasty in China, seeking knowledge, culture, and ideas that could help strengthen his nation. These missions returned with insights into Chinese writing, architecture, music, and administrative techniques. For the first time, Japan began modeling parts of its court, after the Chinese imperial system, not copying blindly, but adapting to fit its needs. Shotoku wasn't just looking outward, he was building inward, reshaping Japan from a loose federation of clans into a more coherent, structured state. The foundations he laid would ripple for generations. Buddhism flourished under his guidance. Temples like Horyuji, one of the oldest wooden structures in the world, were built as centers of worship and learning. Monks played roles not only in religion but also in diplomacy, medicine, and education. The religion didn't replace Shinto, it sat alongside it, forming a dual spiritual identity unique to Japan. Rituals multiplied, deities blended, and the court used Buddhism as a symbol of refinement and wisdom. It wasn't just about belief. It was about optics, alliances, and authority. Spiritual devotion and political ambition were now interlinked. As the Asuka period closed, Japan had changed. It had temples instead of tombs, texts instead of oral myths, and reformers instead of mere warlords. Shotoku died in 622, but his legacy endured in the court systems, the roads, and the scrolls that outlived him. Japan had taken the first steps towards statehood, still fragile, still shaped by clan rivalries, but heading toward a vision far beyond its old tribal past. With religion, philosophy, and foreign influence as tools, the nation was beginning to craft not just identity, but ambition. The Asuka period was short, but it moved the soul of Japan forward. In 710, a new capital was established at Heijō-kyo, present-day Nara, Japan's first planned and permanent city. Designed after the Chinese capital of Chang'an, it marked a deliberate move toward imperial stability. With roads, walls, administrative offices, and a population of nearly 200,000, Nara was a statement. Japan was no longer a loose network of clans. It had a center, and that center was the emperor. Government institutions began to take shape, with ministries managing rituals, taxes, and infrastructure. For the first time, Japan began to look like a nation on paper as well as in vision. To support the system, Japan introduced its first written legal codes, the Taisho Code of 701 and the later Yoro Code. These codes drew heavily from Chinese legal traditions but were adapted to suit Japan's specific needs. They organized land ownership, tax obligations, and the rank structure of the court. More importantly, they formalized the emperor's authority as a divine and legal figure. Under this structure, land was technically owned by the state, but in reality, power still often rested with powerful families. Even as laws were codified, old tensions simmered beneath the surface. Religious development reached monumental heights. The court embraced Buddhism even more deeply, establishing state-sponsored temples in every province. At the center of it all stood Todaiji, completed in the mid-700s, housing the Great Buddha, a towering bronze statue over 15 meters tall. This wasn't just a religious gesture, it was political. The Great Buddha symbolized the unity of religion and state, and the emperor as a protector of both. Monks were given national roles, scriptures were copied en masse, and Buddhist rituals became part of court life. Yet behind this spiritual display, religious institutions began gaining wealth and land, enough to rival the court itself. At the same time, Japan was producing its earliest written histories. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, completed during this period, chronicled Japan's divine origins, early rulers, and legendary events. These texts combined myth, oral tradition, and political agenda into a compelling national narrative. They were not objective histories. They were tools of identity building, meant to validate imperial rule through divine lineage. But they also preserved precious insights into Japan's ancient worldview. Stories of gods, battles, and sacred descent weren't just legends. They were the scaffolding of authority. As the Nara period came to an end, cracks in the system began to show. Monasteries grew too powerful. The court, burdened by costs and factionalism, became unstable. In 794, Emperor Kanmu decided it was time for change. The capital would move again, this time to Heian-kyo, later known as Kyoto. With that move came a new era, but the legacy of Nara would endure, not just in stone and bronze, but in the belief that Japan was a divine land, governed by law, enriched by faith, and anchored by a written past. Nara gave Japan its first face as an imperial civilization. The Heian period is remembered not just for politics, but for beauty, refined, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. When the capital moved to Heian-kyo in 794, it wasn't just a change in location, it was a shift in mood. Court life became centered on elegance, etiquette, and subtlety. A person's worth was measured by their handwriting, the layering of their robes, or their ability to compose a poem on command. Language evolved into an art form, and emotions were not shouted but hinted at, concealed behind gestures, colors, and verse. This was a world ruled by atmosphere, not by arms. At the heart of this culture was literature, and at the heart of literature stood one towering work, The Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu, a noblewoman of the court. Considered the world's first novel, it followed the romantic and emotional life of a prince in exquisite detail. The story was not just a narrative, it was a mirror of the court's emotional and psychological universe. Murasaki's writing blended sensitivity with structure, allowing readers to understand longing, duty, and the quiet despair beneath the silk screens. In her world, love was not shouted. It was whispered across seasons. Art flourished in the quiet spaces of Heian palaces. Painting styles like Yamato depicted Japanese themes with soft, flowing lines and rich color palettes. Sliding doors and scrolls became canvases for landscapes, poems, and seasonal scenes. Calligraphy was more than writing. It was a performance of identity, a display of grace through brushstroke. The way one held a fan, the scent of one's robes, even the cadence of speech, all were part of a carefully curated life. Heian culture prized restraint over power, nuance over dominance. In this world, silence often spoke louder than words. Women played a profound role in shaping the period's culture. While excluded from official politics, noblewomen were central to Heian literature, fashion, and artistic refinement. Their diaries and poems preserved the tone of the age, revealing a world where emotion and social expectation were in constant tension. Lady Sarashina, Sei Shonagon, and Murasaki Shikibu wrote in vivid personal voices that still echo today. Their words reveal the daily life of the palace, moonlit walks, secret notes, changing seasons, and quiet heartbreak. Through them, we see the human side of history, one not written in blood, but in ink and silence. Yet, this dazzling elegance was confined to the capital. Beyond Heian-kyo, the countryside remained rugged, raw, and far removed from courtly aesthetics. Peasants worked fields, local clans held power, and distant provinces often governed themselves. The court may have mastered the art of beauty, but it had not mastered the land. That disconnect would come at a cost. As Heian court culture flourished, its political control quietly weakened. Power remained in name with the emperor, but real authority often shifted to regents from the powerful Fujiwara clan, who controlled court appointments through strategic marriages. Over time, this centralized structure became top-heavy, beautiful on the surface, but brittle underneath. Tax revenues declined, local officials grew corrupt, and far-off provinces drifted from the court's reach. While the aristocracy perfected poetry and perfume, they neglected governance and defense. The imbalance between capital and countryside widened with each passing generation. In the provinces, a new class was rising, the bushi, or warrior class. But these men weren't concerned with court rituals. They were landowners, fighters, and defenders of their territories. Local elites who once served the court began to form private militias to protect their interests. These warriors were not yet unified, but their values, discipline, loyalty, and martial skill were taking root. In lands where imperial tax collectors could no longer operate, samurai enforced order. Authority was shifting from brush to blade. Clashes between clans became more frequent. The central government could no longer maintain a national army or assert control beyond the capital. Two clans in particular, the Taira and the Minamoto, began gaining influence, eventually challenging each other in the court itself. Their rivalry wasn't just personal, it was systemic. The court could no longer contain the ambitions it had fostered. Japan's politics were moving from palaces to battlefields. Even the emperor's symbolic role was strained. Retired emperors sometimes tried to reassert control through cloistered rule, where they governed from behind the scenes after abdication. These efforts only added layers of complexity and further diluted power. The court, once guided by poetry and philosophy, was now tangled in factionalism and internal decay. Beauty still filled the halls of Kyoto, but beyond its walls, swords were being drawn. By the close of the Heian period in 1185, Japan stood at a crossroads. The court's cultural legacy was unmatched. Its literature, aesthetics, and philosophy would shape Japanese identity for centuries. But its political control was finished. The capital remained, but the country was no longer ruled from within it. A new era was dawning, one of warlords, castles, and iron discipline. The age of the samurai had begun. By the end of the 12th century, Japan stood at the edge of a new kind of power. The Genpei War had torn the nation apart, a brutal struggle between the Minamoto and Taira clans, two of the most dominant warrior families in the country. After years of bloodshed, the Minamoto emerged victorious, and in 1292, their leader Minamoto Yoritomo was named Sei Taishogun, the first shogun in Japanese history. Unlike emperors, who ruled symbolically, Yoritomo held real military and political control. His base in Kamakura, far from the elegant Heian court in Kyoto, marked a shift in Japan's center of power, from culture to command. The imperial court remained, but the sword now ruled the land. The Kamakura shogunate established a new model of governance, practical, military, and decentralized. Yoritomo appointed military governors called Shugo and Jito to oversee provinces, manage tax collection, and enforce order. This system favored loyalty and control, rewarding vassals with land in return for service. Laws were written to settle land disputes and strengthen discipline within the warrior class. While the emperor still held a throne, the real decisions came from Kamakura, where warriors shaped the nation's fate. Japan was no longer a land of poets and courtiers alone. It had become a warrior state. This new power structure changed the social order. The samurai class became the backbone of the country, bound by loyalty and personal honor. They lived by unwritten codes of conduct, duty, frugality, readiness to die in battle. Unlike the pampered nobility of earlier eras, samurai earned their place through discipline and combat. Villages and provinces now answered to warriors, not aristocrats. Respect was earned with the sword, not with a brush. But even shogun rule had limits. In 1274 and again in 1281, Mongol forces under Kublai Khan attempted to invade Japan. Though heavily outnumbered, Japanese defenders held firm, aided both by fierce resistance and typhoons, the legendary kamikaze or divine winds that destroyed Mongol fleets. These victories boosted national pride and reinforced the idea that Japan was protected by the gods. Yet, defending the nation drained the treasury, and because there were no lands to distribute as rewards, many samurai returned home unpaid. Discontent grew beneath the surface. By the 14th century, the Kamakura shogunate began to weaken. Internal strife, failed reforms, and the growing frustration of warriors who felt unrecognized eventually opened the door to rebellion. In 1333, the imperial court, under Emperor Go-Daigo, briefly overthrew the shogunate with the help of Ashikaga Takauji, a powerful general who would soon claim control for himself. The Kamakura era had introduced the shogun as ruler, but its fall showed how fragile military power could be without unity. Japan was entering another storm. After the fall of Kamakura, Japan did not return to imperial rule. Instead, Ashikaga Takauji turned against the emperor he once supported and seized power for himself. In 1338, he became shogun and established a new government in the Muromachi district of Kyoto. While the Ashikaga shogunate reintroduced rule from the capital, it never had the same control that Yoritomo once held. Power was fragmented, alliances were unstable, and regional lords began carving out territories of their own. This was the beginning of a long, unstable period marked by conflict and shifting loyalties. The Ashikaga rulers maintained only loose control over the country. Unlike the Kamakura system, which placed governors across provinces, the Ashikaga relied heavily on loyalty from regional lords, known as daimyo. These daimyo became increasingly independent, building their own armies, issuing local laws, and even waging war against each other. The shogunate became more symbolic than central, and the emperor's role continued as ceremonial. In reality, Japan was ruled by dozens of competing warlords, each focused on survival and expansion. Diplomacy, betrayal, and conquest became daily realities. The chaos intensified in the Onin War, 1467 to 1477, a civil war that erupted over succession disputes and devastated the capital. Kyoto was burned, abandoned, and overrun by competing armies. With the Ashikaga authority in ruins, the country fractured into dozens of autonomous domains. This era, later known as the Sengoku, or Warring States period, saw Japan plunged into over a century of near constant conflict. Power no longer flowed from the shogun's palace. It came from fortified castles, battlefields, and sieges. Japan became a land ruled by the sword once again, but now with no center at all. Despite the turmoil, culture and trade still flourished in some regions. The Muromachi period gave birth to Zen Buddhism's spread, no theater, and the rise of the tea ceremony as a symbol of inner discipline. Art and architecture reflected a return to simplicity, balance, and natural form. Even amid war, Japanese culture matured in silence and structure. Warlords competed not only in battle, but in sponsoring temples and patronizing the arts. The chaos of politics stood in contrast to the quiet refinement of culture. By the mid-1500s, Japan was a patchwork of fiercely independent domains. The Ashikaga shogunate still existed in name, but its influence was largely gone. Daimyo ruled through might, and the strongest among them began dreaming of something bigger, total unification. Yet, just as this internal war reached its height, strangers from across the sea would arrive, and everything would change again. In 1543, a Portuguese ship drifted onto Tanegashima, a small island off Kyushu's southern coast. With it came something that Japan had never seen before: firearms. The arrival of European traders, missionaries, and weapons marked the beginning of the Nanban trade, meaning Southern Barbarian exchange. These visitors were strange, loud, and unfamiliar, but they brought goods that would transform Japan's battlefield, economy, and even its belief systems. For the first time in centuries, Japan opened its shores to a truly foreign presence. The most immediate impact came through weaponry. The Japanese quickly adopted and refined the arquebus, a matchlock gun, integrating it into their samurai armies. Within a generation, guns were produced domestically and used in battles across the country. Traditional sword duels gave way to mass volleys of fire, and castles were redesigned to withstand bullets. The daimyo who embraced these changes gained the edge in warfare. Innovation now walked hand in hand with ambition. Religion also found a foothold. Jesuit missionaries, led by Francis Xavier, began preaching Christianity to the Japanese, often with surprising success. Many daimyo converted for political advantage, hoping to trade with Europeans or gain access to new goods. Thousands of commoners followed, drawn to the new faith's message of salvation and equality. Churches were built, and crosses stood beside pagodas. For a brief moment, Christianity was not just tolerated, it was spreading fast. Alongside weapons and religion came global commerce. Japan exported silver, sulfur, and lacquerware, while importing textiles, glass, books, and spices. European ships brought new foods, new maps, and rumors of distant empires. Japanese traders and mercenaries even began appearing in Southeast Asia, showing that the island nation was no longer isolated. The Nanban era created connections that stretched far beyond China or Korea. The world was suddenly wider, and Japan was no longer watching from the sidelines. Yet, beneath the surface, tension brewed. Not all daimyo welcomed foreign influence, and some grew suspicious of Christianity's growing power. The seeds of restriction were already being planted. But for now, Japan stood at the crossroads of tradition and transformation, armed with guns, guided by gods, and staring out at a world it could no longer ignore. Even during the political chaos of the Muromachi period, Japanese culture reached new levels of depth and refinement. Zen Buddhism, imported earlier from China, became the silent force behind many of the era's most enduring practices. Zen encouraged stillness, discipline, and attention to the present moment, qualities that shaped the soul of Muromachi aesthetics. This influence took root in every corner of elite life, from the layout of gardens to the structure of theatrical performance. Art was no longer meant to dazzle. It was meant to empty the mind, slow the breath, and awaken clarity. In war and in peace, simplicity became a form of strength. One of the clearest expressions of this philosophy was the tea ceremony, known as chanoyu. Developed over generations and refined by masters like Senno Rikyu, the tea ceremony was more than a drink. It was a spiritual and social ritual. Every movement had purpose. Every object was chosen with care, and the environment was designed to foster presence and humility. Samurai, monks, and aristocrats all practiced it as a way to cultivate inner calm and mutual respect. It was not about wealth or display, but about quiet connection. In a time of war, the tea room offered stillness. Gardens, too, became places of reflection rather than grandeur. Influenced by Zen and Chinese painting, Muromachi gardens emphasized asymmetry, natural elements, and the balance of emptiness and form. Rocks, moss, sand, and carefully shaped trees created landscapes meant to suggest mountains, rivers, and seasons. These were not spaces for walking, but for watching. Meditative scenes designed to still the spirit. The garden was a mirror of the mind, and like the tea ceremony, it reflected the belief that peace could be found in precision and quiet. The era also gave birth to no theater, a highly stylized form of performance blending dance, chant, masks, and minimal movement. No plays were slow, poetic, and symbolic, often drawing from ancient stories, legends, and Buddhist themes. Emotions were expressed not through action, but through subtle gestures and haunting music. The stage was almost bare, allowing the imagination to fill the space. Audiences didn't come to be entertained. They came to contemplate. In its sparseness, No captured the tension between life and death, joy and loss, action and stillness. While politics fractured, this culture held something steady. It taught discipline in an age of disorder and clarity in a world clouded by ambition. Even warlords and generals paused to build gardens, perform tea rituals, and sponsor No performances. These practices outlasted the shogunate that nurtured them, becoming pillars of Japanese identity for centuries to come. In an age of shifting power, Muromachi culture left something permanent, a way of seeing the world through patience, stillness, and deliberate grace. By the late 1500s, Japan had spent over a century in fragmented warfare. Dozens of daimyo ruled their territories as independent warlords, with no one strong enough to reunite the land. That changed with the rise of Oda Nobunaga, a ruthless and innovative leader from Owari province. In 1568, he marched into Kyoto, installed a puppet shogun, and declared his intent to restore order on his own terms. Nobunaga rejected tradition when it no longer served him. He embraced firearms, broke the power of Buddhist warrior monks, and reshaped how war was fought in Japan. Nobunaga understood that old codes would not bring unity. He built alliances through intimidation, strategic marriages, and sheer military force. One by one, he crushed his rivals, driving fear and awe into those who stood in his way. His castle at Azuchi, towering above Lake Biwa, symbolized a new kind of power, centralized, modern, and ruthless. He welcomed foreign merchants, encouraged trade, and even allowed Christian missionaries to operate freely. In his hands, Japan began to shift from feudal chaos to a new, more focused force. But he would not live to finish the job. In 1582, Nobunaga was betrayed by one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, and forced to take his own life in a temple near Kyoto. His death left a power vacuum, but one of his top commanders, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, moved quickly to avenge him. Hideyoshi was not born into nobility. He rose from peasant origins to become Japan's most powerful man, a rare feat in a rigid society. He completed the unification Nobunaga had started, bringing the last holdout clans under his rule. Through diplomacy, warfare, and clever manipulation, he became the de facto ruler of Japan. Hideyoshi ruled without claiming the title of shogun, instead working through court appointments and personal authority. He implemented policies to freeze the social order, forbidding peasants from owning weapons and restricting samurai from farming. These efforts were meant to stabilize the class system and prevent rebellion. He also undertook ambitious building projects, including the massive Osaka Castle, and launched 2 failed invasions of Korea in the 1590s. Though those wars drained resources and cost thousands of lives, they revealed the scale of his ambition. Hideyoshi wanted Japan not just united, he wanted it feared. By the time of Hideyoshi's death in 1598, Japan had been reshaped. The feudal wars were ending, the social classes were fixed, power had shifted again, no longer in the hands of dozens of lords, but in the grip of one leader and his military machine. But with no clear successor, tensions began to rise. The nation stood on the edge of another test, and the man who would answer it, Tokugawa Ieyasu, was already preparing for his turn. The age of unification was over. The age of enduring peace was about to begin. At a cost, in 1600, everything changed. At the Battle of Sekigahara, Tokugawa Ieyasu defeated his last major rivals and set the course for over 250 years of peace. This was not just a military victory. It was a reshaping of power. 2 years later, Ieyasu was granted the title of shogun, and he established his government in Edo, now Tokyo. The imperial court in Kyoto remained as a ceremonial body, but real authority shifted to the Tokugawa shogunate. For the first time in centuries, Japan was stable, united, and ruled with precision. The Tokugawa regime did not leave anything to chance. Ieyasu created a highly ordered society with rigid controls on movement, allegiance, and behavior. The bakufu, or military government, enforced loyalty through surveillance, hostage systems, and enforced isolation. All daimyo were required to maintain alternate residences in Edo, forcing them to travel back and forth in costly, symbolic loyalty. This system, known as Sankin Kotai, drained resources from regional lords while centralizing power. Control became as much psychological as it was military. Peace came at a cost: freedom. The Tokugawa government enforced strict social hierarchies with no tolerance for deviation. People were born into a class, and they stayed there. Samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants were locked into defined roles, and crossing those lines was nearly impossible. Movement between provinces was restricted. Even religion was monitored closely, as Christianity was outlawed and brutally suppressed after early tolerance in the 1500s. Foreign contact was also brought to a halt. After the Shimabara Rebellion in the 1630s, which had ties to Christian converts, the shogunate implemented the Sakoku policy, closing Japan to almost all outside influence. Trade was limited to a few carefully controlled ports, and only the Dutch and Chinese were allowed minimal contact. Japan turned inward, developing its own systems without interruption from colonial powers. Isolation allowed for peace, but it also set Japan apart from a rapidly changing world. Under Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors, Japan entered a long period of peace, control, and cultural refinement. The battles of previous centuries faded into memory, replaced by stability that touched every corner of the country. But beneath that peace was a tightly wound structure. Every move was watched, every role was fixed, and while the nation appeared quiet on the surface, questions were beginning to form deep below. At the top of the Tokugawa system stood the shogun, the supreme military leader who ruled in the emperor's name but without real interference. The shogun's word was law, and he controlled all political, economic, and military affairs from Edo. Below him were the daimyo, regional lords who governed their own domains but owed allegiance to the central shogunate. Their power was kept in check through forced residence, gift obligations, and constant surveillance. No daimyo could act without the shogun's permission. The system was tight, intentional, and designed for obedience. Beneath the daimyo were the samurai, once warriors of battle, now bureaucrats of peace. Many served as tax collectors, administrators, and enforcers of the Tokugawa legal code. Stripped of their need to fight, they became scholars, teachers, and civil servants. Still, their identity remained tied to honor, duty, and hierarchy. Though some fell into poverty as stipends failed to keep up with prices, they were still held above commoners. A failed samurai was still a samurai, and the class distinction mattered. The largest group in society were the peasants, who made up nearly 80% of the population. They were expected to farm, obey, and pay taxes, often harshly. While technically above artisans and merchants in the social order, they lived under the heaviest burden. They were not allowed to leave their land without permission. Famines, bad harvests, and corrupt officials made survival a challenge. Peasant uprisings did occur, quiet at first but more frequent as time went on. Artisans came next, respected for their skill but still restricted in status. They produced swords, lacquerware, ceramics, and tools that supported both the military and everyday life. Each artisan was part of a guild, regulated and taxed under Tokugawa law. Their work was crucial, but they remained limited by the rigid class system. Even excellence could not earn social mobility. Skill did not equal status. At the bottom were the merchants, ironically the richest but most disrespected class. They traded rice, managed warehouses, ran financial networks, and funded the economy, but their position remained officially low. In Tokugawa thinking, wealth not earned by labor was dishonorable. Still, merchants quietly gained influence, forming family dynasties, sponsoring art, and even loaning money to samurai in debt. The Tokugawa structure honored warriors, but it was merchants who were quietly gaining power behind the curtain. While society was rigid and movement restricted, culture flourished. In the busy merchant districts of Edo, kabuki theater exploded in popularity. It was loud, colorful, and emotional, a complete contrast to the reserved world of the samurai. Performers used elaborate costumes, exaggerated gestures, and music to tell stories of revenge, love, and betrayal. Audiences packed the theaters. Though the government attempted to regulate its excesses, kabuki became the voice of the common people. bold, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. Alongside performance came visual art. The ukiyo-e movement, meaning pictures of the floating world, captured the vibrancy of urban life. These woodblock prints showed actors, courtesans, landscapes, and moments of daily beauty. Artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige elevated the form, blending precision with poetic imagery. Their works became widely distributed, accessible even to those of modest means. The floating world was temporary, fleeting, but it was celebrated with color, humor, and elegance. Literature also found its rhythm. The haiku, a 3-line poem with 17 syllables, became the perfect form for capturing small, profound moments. Poets like Matsuo Basho wandered the countryside, recording nature, silence, and fleeting impressions with discipline and grace. His travel journals combined prose and poetry, showing a quiet reverence for impermanence. In a world ruled by control, haiku offered release, a moment of clarity in a structured society. Poetry became not just expression, but reflection. Philosophically, the Tokugawa government leaned heavily on Neo-Confucianism. Imported from China, it emphasized duty, hierarchy, loyalty, and moral self-cultivation. These ideals reinforced the existing social structure, giving it ethical justification. Obedience to one's superior was a virtue. Personal desires were to be suppressed in favor of harmony and social order. This worldview was taught in schools, enforced in laws, and preached by officials. Still, other ideas coexisted. Shinto rituals continued quietly, tied to agriculture and family life. Buddhism remained present, though less politically dominant than before. Together, these belief systems created a spiritual world where discipline, harmony, and beauty shaped thought and practice. The Edo period did not allow freedom, but within its walls, creativity found a way to breathe. It would be this culture, this balance between restriction and artistry, that would define Japan for generations. For over 2 centuries, Japan stood alone. After years of Christian missionary expansion and colonial pressure, the Tokugawa regime shut its doors to the world. The Sakoku policy, or closed country, was fully established by the 1630s. Foreign ships were banned from Japanese ports. Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving the country, and if they did, they could not return. The shogunate didn't just turn its back on the outside, it bolted the door shut. The motivation behind Sakoku was rooted in control and fear. The shogunate viewed foreign religion and commerce as threats to its fragile stability. Christianity was outlawed and punished by death, especially after the violent Shimabara rebellion, which involved many Christian peasants. To prevent similar uprisings, the regime purged churches, missionaries, and local converts. This wasn't just about belief, it was about loyalty. The Tokugawa feared any force that could compete with its authority. Despite its isolationist stance, Japan never fully cut ties with the world. Trade was restricted but not eliminated. A single port, Dejima, an artificial island in Nagasaki, served as the narrow window to global commerce. Only 2 nations were allowed to trade there, the Dutch and the Chinese. The Dutch were favored because they focused purely on business and avoided evangelism. From this small island, Japan imported books, medicines, technology, and scientific instruments, all under tight surveillance. Through this limited contact, Japan managed to absorb just enough knowledge to keep up. Scholars quietly translated Western texts, especially in medicine, astronomy, and geography. This became known as Rangaku, or Dutch learning. It was a paradox, a nation that closed itself off, yet still learned through whispers and controlled exchanges. The shogunate didn't want to evolve too fast, but it also didn't want to be left behind completely. Sakoku gave Japan over 2 centuries of peace, cultural development, and internal cohesion. But as Europe and America expanded their empires and industrialized rapidly, Japan's isolation began to look like a disadvantage. The outside world was moving, and Japan was standing still. The clock was ticking, and soon that quiet harbor in Nagasaki would no longer be the only place where foreign ships appeared. The moment everything changed came on a gray morning in July 1853. 4 black-hulled American warships steamed into Edo Bay, led by Commodore Matthew Perry. They were larger, louder, and more powerful than anything Japan had ever seen. The cannons alone were a message. Perry handed over a letter from U.S. President Millard Fillmore, demanding that Japan open its ports to American ships. Then he turned and left, promising to return for an answer. Perry's visit wasn't just a diplomatic gesture, it was a show of force. Japan had no navy strong enough to resist. The shogunate, unprepared and unsure, scrambled for a response. When Perry returned in 1854, the Tokugawa signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. It opened 2 ports to American ships, allowed for a U.S. consulate, and guaranteed decent treatment for shipwrecked sailors. It was only the beginning. Other Western nations quickly followed, demanding their own treaties, and getting them. These were not agreements between equals. The new deals were called unequal treaties for a reason. Foreigners were granted extraterritorial rights, meaning they were not subject to Japanese law. Tariffs on imports were set by Western powers, not Japan. Ports were forced open without reciprocal access. Japan, once sealed off and sovereign, was now being carved open under pressure. And many within the country saw this for what it was: humiliation. The signing of these treaties exposed deep cracks in Tokugawa authority. Many daimyo and samurai, especially from western regions like Satsuma and Choshu, viewed the shogunate's compliance as weak and dishonorable. Political debates turned into protests. Secret alliances formed. Some wanted to expel the foreigners by force. Others believed modernization was the only way forward. For the first time in centuries, the shogun's control began to slip. Power was being questioned, not just by outsiders, but from within. Unrest turned into action. By the late 1860s, reformist domains began calling for the restoration of imperial rule. The emperor, once merely symbolic, was now seen as a source of national unity. In 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun, stepped down under pressure. And in 1868, the Meiji Restoration began. A new era led not by warriors, but by reformers determined to transform Japan from feudal isolation to modern statehood. The samurai world was ending. The modern world had arrived. In 1868, the world that Japan had known for centuries was overturned. The shogunate fell, and power was restored to the emperor in what would be called the Meiji Restoration. The 15-year-old emperor Meiji became the face of a new era, but the true transformation was led by former samurai and reformist leaders who sought to reshape Japan entirely. They abolished the feudal class system, including the samurai's privileged position. The warriors who had once ruled the nation found themselves without stipends, titles, or power. Swords gave way to suits, and tradition bent to the demands of modernity. With feudalism gone, Japan needed a new political framework. In 1889, the Meiji Constitution was promulgated, establishing a constitutional monarchy with a bicameral legislature. Though power still heavily favored the emperor and his cabinet, it introduced legal structures that echoed European systems. The government modeled its constitution on Prussia's, not Britain's, emphasizing centralized power and loyalty to the emperor. This new document wasn't just about governance. It was a tool to present Japan as a modern, civilized state to the Western world. The message was clear: Japan could govern itself and no longer needed to be pressured into unequal treaties. Modernization moved at breakneck speed. Railroads stretched across once remote regions. Telegraph lines crackled with communication. Western science, industry, and military technology were eagerly adopted. former samurai became bureaucrats, officers, or businessmen, the transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Japan went from being a secluded island nation to an emerging power that could rival its Western counterparts in less than a generation. Change was no longer a threat. It became the national mission, but not all transitions were smooth. The abrupt changes left many disoriented. Farmers were taxed heavily, leading to unrest. Former samurai, stripped of their status, sometimes revolted, as seen in the 1877 Satsuma Rebellion. Led by Saigo Takamori, a once loyal Meiji figure, the rebellion was crushed, but it symbolized the death of the old Japan. The government's success in defeating the samurai uprising further cemented the authority of the new state. Japan had chosen its direction. There was no turning back. The Meiji period laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Japan was no longer passive. It was active, ambitious, and determined to stand shoulder to shoulder with global powers. The island was becoming an empire, driven by a belief in progress and a fear of being dominated again. And with its new tools, Japan began to look outward. The Meiji leaders understood that true modernization required more than railroads and factories. It needed a transformed society. Education became a central pillar. In 1872, the government introduced compulsory education for boys and girls. Schools taught Western science and math, but also instilled loyalty to the emperor and pride in national identity. Literacy rates soared. Japan was producing a new generation of thinkers, engineers, and leaders, ready to propel the nation into the modern age. Urban life began to thrive. Tokyo, once Edo, was reborn as a bustling capital. Gas lights lit the streets, and rickshaws darted between brick buildings. Department stores, modeled after European businesses, began to appear. Cities grew rapidly as people left the countryside in search of opportunity. Industrial zones emerged. The rhythms of daily life changed, marked by factory bells rather than temple gongs. Western fashion, music, and ideas flowed in, merging with native culture in complex, sometimes uncomfortable ways. The government encouraged Westernization in public life, but balanced it with deep nationalism. Men wore suits, women adopted corsets, but reverence for the emperor remained sacred. Foreign experts were hired to advise on infrastructure, education, and military reform. Yet over time, these foreign advisors were replaced by Japanese professionals who had mastered the knowledge. Japan was not just borrowing ideas, it was adapting them, improving them, and making them its own. This fusion defined the modern Japanese identity. Social hierarchies were also restructured. The four-class system of samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants was legally abolished. In its place came a merit-based civil service and a new aristocracy loyal to the state. Peasants gained mobility, though life in rural areas remained difficult. Women began entering schools, though their roles remained largely domestic. The shift was incomplete but undeniable. A society rooted in centuries-old tradition was now in motion. Westernization sparked debates. Some feared Japan was losing its soul. Others argued that embracing change was the only way to survive. What united both sides was the urgency of the moment. Japan was racing against time to avoid colonization, and that race shaped every reform. The country was no longer isolated, and it could not afford to be unprepared. Transformation was not an option. It was the cost of survival. As Japan modernized at home, it began looking outward. For centuries, it had feared foreign powers. Now, it aims to become one. The first test of this new ambition came in 1894, when Japan went to war with China over influence in Korea. The First Sino-Japanese War was swift and decisive. Japan's new navy and modern army crushed the Qing forces. It was a stunning reversal. The student had outperformed the master. The Treaty of Shimonoseki ended the war in 1895, granting Japan control over Taiwan and recognition of Korea's independence. But when Japan tried to claim Port Arthur, three Western powers, Russia, France, and Germany, intervened and forced Japan to retreat. This so-called triple intervention stung deeply. Japan had won the war, but was treated like a second-class power. It was a painful reminder: modernization wasn't enough. Respect had to be earned through strength. Japan responded by doubling down on military development. Over the next decade, it built a navy that rivaled those of the West. Tensions with Russia grew, especially over interests in Manchuria and Korea. In 1904, Japan struck first. The Russo-Japanese War began with a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. Japan fought on land and sea, proving its forces were disciplined, modern, and relentless. The world watched in disbelief. An Asian power was defeating a European giant. After brutal fighting, the war ended in 1905 with the Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Japan gained control over Port Arthur, parts of Manchuria, and official dominance in Korea. But more than territory, Japan gained international respect. For the first time, an Eastern nation had defeated a Western empire in modern warfare. It changed global perceptions and reshaped power dynamics in Asia. Imperialism brought prestige, but also danger. Japan's success fueled national pride and militaristic thinking. The military gained influence in the government. Expansion became a strategy, not just a goal. The victories of the Meiji period had made Japan a major player on the world stage, but with power came responsibility and ambition. The island nation had transformed. Now it would face the consequences of becoming an empire. The heartbeat of a modern empire is often found in its machines. For Japan, that beat began to echo across steel tracks and factory floors during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Railways stretched across the islands, linking once isolated communities and opening new markets. Factories rose in place of rice fields. Textile mills, shipyards, and steel plants became the backbone of an emerging industrial economy. The government invested heavily in infrastructure, and zaibatsu, powerful business conglomerates, grew rich under state patronage. It was a time of rapid growth, but not everyone shared in the prosperity. Working conditions were brutal. Laborers worked long hours, often over 12 hours a day for low wages. Factory accidents were common, and child labor was widespread. Women, especially in textile mills, faced not only physical hardship, but also social stigma. The cost of modernization was being paid in sweat and silence by Japan's working class. The government focused on output and national prestige, but the voices from the factory floors grew louder. Something was boiling beneath the surface. By the early 20th century, labor unrest began to spread. Workers formed unions, though often unofficial and under threat of police crackdowns. Strikes increased, particularly in the mining and textile sectors. In 1907, the Ashio copper mine strike became a symbol of the new labor consciousness. Workers demanded better wages, safety, and dignity. But the response was harsh. The government viewed such movements as threats to national stability, and many organizers were arrested or silenced. Still, the movement had begun. The masses had started to question the cost of progress. The inequality was not only economic. Japan's modernization had created a clear divide between urban and rural populations. While cities like Tokyo and Osaka buzzed with new industries and Western-style buildings, the countryside remained mired in poverty and tradition. Peasants struggled with taxes and land scarcity, and many young people left their villages in search of factory work. The illusion of national progress masked a deeper fragmentation. Beneath the clean lines of trains and chimneys, Japan was a nation divided. Education also played a role in this transformation. Literacy rates climbed, and the state promoted a strong sense of nationalism through textbooks and public rituals. Students were taught obedience and loyalty to the emperor, but they also learned to think and question. A new generation of Japanese, shaped by factories and classrooms alike, would grow up expecting more. not just from their economy, but from their government. The seeds of political change were taking root in the soil of industrial labor. When Emperor Meiji passed in 1912, his son Yoshihito ascended the throne, ushering in what would be called the Taisho era. Though his reign was short and marked by poor health, the years between 1912 and 1926 witnessed profound change. This was Japan's flirtation with liberalism, democracy, and cultural experimentation. Unlike the rigid control of the Meiji period, the Taisho years saw a society beginning to speak for itself. Political parties gained influence, women's voices entered public debate, and art took daring new forms. The heart of the Taisho period lay in the rise of democratic ideals. The 1920s became known as the era of Taisho democracy. Universal male suffrage was achieved in 1925, giving voice to millions. Political parties, such as the Rikenseiyokai and Kensikai, battled for control of the Diet. Newspapers flourished, and public discourse expanded beyond state propaganda. Intellectuals debated socialism, feminism, and pacifism. For the first time, politics was not just the domain of the elite. The people had begun to believe they had a stake in shaping their nation's destiny. Internationally, Japan took bold steps. During World War I, Japan sided with the Allies, seizing German-held territories in China and the Pacific. This brought both economic gain and international recognition. Japan joined the League of Nations and sat at the table during the Washington Naval Conference. It was no longer an isolated island nation. Japan had become a global player, militarily, economically, and diplomatically. Yet, with power came scrutiny. The West viewed Japan with a mix of admiration and unease. Inside Japan, too, there was tension about how far the nation should lean toward Western ideals. Culturally, the Taisho period was a time of experimentation. In Tokyo, the moga, or modern girl, challenged traditional gender roles with short hair and Western dresses. Jazz clubs, silent films, and new literary magazines blossomed. Authors like Akutagawa Ryunosuke explored the darker corners of the human psyche. Artists broke away from rigid forms and embraced modernism. For a brief moment, Japan felt the pulse of the modern world not just in machines but in minds. It was a society in conversation with itself, a dance between old and new. But the dream of Taisho democracy would not last. The end of the era saw growing economic problems, including the devastating 1923 Great Kanto earthquake. The disaster killed over 100,000 people and flattened Tokyo. In its aftermath, violence erupted against Koreans and socialists, revealing the fragility of Japan's liberal experiment. As conservative forces regrouped and military voices grew louder, the stage was being set for a shift. The Taisho period closed with the promise of democracy dimming and the shadow of authoritarianism creeping in. A storm was coming. When Emperor Hirohito ascended to the throne in 1926, Japan stood at a crossroads. Modernization had made the empire powerful, but that power now sought validation beyond its shores. Nationalist ideals mixed with military ambitions, and soon, generals began steering policy more than politicians. In classrooms, students learned not only math and science, but also the glory of dying for the emperor. The government, increasingly under military control, prioritized expansion over diplomacy. The stage was set for aggression disguised as destiny. In 1931, Japanese officers staged the infamous Mukden incident, a railway explosion they blamed on Chinese forces. It was a calculated move. Within days, Japanese troops invaded Manchuria, quickly establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. This bold land grab stunned the world and led to Japan's withdrawal from the League of Nations. But for the military elite, it was only the beginning. They saw China as weak, divided, and ripe for domination. Civilian voices opposing war were silenced, and Japan's military machine shifted into high gear. By 1937, conflict with China erupted full-scale in the Second Sino-Japanese War. The war saw the brutal Battle of Shanghai, the fall of Nanjing, and the unspeakable atrocities that followed. Japanese soldiers massacred civilians, raped thousands of women, and left the world horrified. International condemnation grew, but Tokyo remained defiant. Propaganda painted Japan as a liberator of Asia, fighting Western imperialism. But in truth, Japan's campaign was driven by conquest, resource hunger, and ideological supremacy. As the war dragged on, Japan grew more isolated diplomatically. It aligned itself with Germany and Italy in the Axis Pact, deepening global concern. The government fostered a cult of sacrifice, urging civilians to embrace hardship for the empire's glory. Resources were redirected toward war production, while dissenters vanished into prisons. Japan had transformed into a fully militarized state, convinced of its divine mission. The rest of the world braced for a wider conflict, knowing Japan was no longer just a regional threat. At home, the public lived under strict control, but support for the empire remained high. Children practiced military drills in schoolyards. Newspapers glorified victories and erased defeats. The emperor, though distant, was revered as a living god. The nation had taken a dangerous path, one paved by ambition, sealed by propaganda, and led by generals whose dreams would soon bring catastrophe. On December 7, 1941, the world changed in a single morning. Japanese warplanes roared over Pearl Harbor, launching a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. America, stunned and enraged, declared war the next day. Japan had hoped to cripple U.S. power quickly, securing dominance in Asia, but instead it awoke a sleeping giant. World War II had become a global inferno, and Japan was now at its center. Initial victories came fast. Japan swept through Southeast Asia, capturing the Philippines, Indonesia, and parts of the Pacific. The rising sun flag flew over vast territories. But the tide began to turn in 1942 at the Battle of Midway. American forces sank 4 Japanese carriers, halting Japan's momentum. Slowly, island by island, the U.S. began its counteroffensive. Battles grew bloodier. The jungle fighting was relentless. Japanese troops, driven by code and honor, often chose death over surrender. On the home front, Japanese civilians endured firebombings, rationing, and rising casualties. Cities like Tokyo were reduced to ashes. Still, the government refused to consider defeat. In 1945, the Battle of Okinawa signaled how far Japan would go to avoid surrender. Kamikaze pilots crashed into ships. Soldiers fought to the last man. It became clear, ending the war would demand an unimaginable cost. Then came Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. A single bomb vaporized the city. 3 days later, Nagasaki met the same fate. Over 200,000 people died. The world saw the birth of nuclear warfare, and Japan saw the end of its imperial dream. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation in a radio broadcast, the first time his people had heard his voice. He called for peace, acknowledging Japan's surrender. The war was over. Japan lay in ruins, its cities destroyed, its people shattered, and its army defeated. But even in this darkness, a new chapter was waiting, one shaped not by generals, but by civilians, not by conquest, but by reconstruction. And it would begin under the watchful eyes of its former enemy. Following Japan's surrender, American forces led by General Douglas MacArthur assumed control. The occupation of Japan wasn't just about disarmament, it was about transformation. The goal was clear: rebuild Japan as a peaceful, democratic nation. For a country long ruled by militarism, this was an earthquake. Institutions were torn down, laws rewritten, and society reimagined from the ground up. One of the boldest reforms was the new Constitution of 1947. It stripped the emperor of political power, though he remained a symbolic figure. Article 9 renounced war forever, banning Japan from maintaining a traditional military. women gained the right to vote. Labor unions were legalized. For the first time, freedom of speech, press, and religion were guaranteed. These were radical changes, a complete rewrite of Japan's national identity. Economically, the U.S. implemented land reforms that broke up large estates and empowered tenant farmers. New industries were encouraged, and education was overhauled to promote critical thinking and civic values. War criminals faced justice in the Tokyo trials. At the same time, the U.S. kept Hirohito on the throne to preserve stability. It was a delicate balance, honoring Japanese culture while breaking the system that led to war. The Japanese people responded with resilience. Despite food shortages and uncertainty, they embraced the changes. Factories were rebuilt, schools reopened, and cities slowly came back to life. A nation that once bowed to militarism was now learning the language of democracy. The wounds of war were deep, but the foundation for peace was being laid. By 1952, the occupation officially ended. Japan regained its sovereignty. It was no longer an empire, but a peaceful nation with a new direction. The old order had been dismantled, and from its ashes, something remarkable began to grow. A modern Japan that would soon astonish the world. Japan's post-war recovery wasn't just a story of rebuilding, it was an economic rebirth that shocked the world. From the ashes of war, Japan became the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s. The country invested heavily in manufacturing, infrastructure, and education, laying the groundwork for what became known as the Japanese economic miracle. Companies like Toyota, Honda, Sony, and Panasonic turned into global giants, pushing innovation in automobiles, electronics, and robotics. Bullet trains connected cities with speed and precision, showcasing engineering that was decades ahead of its time. For a generation, Japan's name was synonymous with quality, efficiency, and futuristic design. In this boom, Tokyo rose as a symbol of modernity and urban sophistication. Skyscrapers, neon lights, and efficient transit gave the world a glimpse of a high-tech future. The tech sector blossomed with the rise of home computers, gaming consoles like the Nintendo Entertainment System and Sony PlayStation, and advances in semiconductors. In education, Japan achieved one of the highest literacy rates globally, and its students consistently ranked among the top in math and science. There was a sense of national pride, the belief that Japan had arrived as a global leader not by conquest, but by competence. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. By the late 1980s, asset prices ballooned, fueled by speculative real estate and stock market bubbles. In 1991, the bubble burst, plunging Japan into what became known as the Lost Decade. Growth slowed, wages stagnated, and deflation haunted the economy. The Bank of Japan responded with ultra-low interest rates and fiscal stimulus, but recovery was sluggish. Socially, the effects were visible. Young people delayed marriage, birth rates dropped, and economic anxiety became a generational concern. Yet, Japan remained stable, resilient, and committed to innovation even in hard times. The Heisei period was not only economic, it was also cultural and global. Japan exported more than cars and electronics. It exported its identity. Anime surged in global popularity with titles like Dragon Ball, Pokemon, and Sailor Moon. Japanese cuisine, once seen as exotic, became mainstream across Western cities. Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry highlighted Japan's scientific contributions. Domestically, democratic institutions held strong, and debates about Japan's pacifist constitution gained urgency. While the economy may have cooled, Japan's influence in arts, science, and technology remained red-hot. The transition from Emperor Hirohito to Emperor Akihito, and eventually to Emperor Naruhito in 2019, symbolized a generational shift. The Heisei era ended not with collapse, but with quiet evolution. Japan stepped into the 21st century not as a loud superpower, but as a quiet force of stability and creativity. Though the world changed around it, Japan stayed uniquely itself, adaptable, disciplined, and forward-looking. The Reiwa era began under the shadow of uncertainty, economically, environmentally, and politically. But Japan, true to its legacy, met each challenge with resolve. In diplomacy, Japan increased its global presence. It strengthened ties with ASEAN, hosted the G7 summit, and took a lead in promoting climate initiatives. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida emphasized new capitalism, seeking to correct income disparities while promoting technological investment. Despite internal debates over defense spending and demographic decline, Japan held its ground as a model of peace and diplomacy. The 2021 Tokyo Olympics, delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, became a moment of pride and perseverance. Though held without spectators, the Games showcased Japan's organizational excellence and respect for global cooperation. Meanwhile, Japan continued its recovery from the 2011 Fukushima disaster with advanced decontamination technology and policy transparency. In 2023, Toyota debuted one of the world's most advanced hydrogen-powered vehicles, and by 2025, Japanese EV infrastructure became among the most efficient globally. Japan's space agency JAXA also made strides, collaborating with NASA and ESA for lunar missions and asteroid sample returns. Japan's economic influence also adapted to modern times. The entertainment industry alone generated over $86 billion annually by 2025. The 2025 Japan Mobility Show highlighted cutting-edge automotive design, reaffirming Japan's engineering prowess. In music, fashion, and digital innovation, Japanese creators continue to shape trends worldwide. Even amid challenges, an aging population, labor shortages, and climate threats, Japan remains a nation that blends tradition with cutting-edge innovation. The Reiwa period is still unfolding, but one truth is clear: Japan once again is quietly leading the future.